By the late 1940s, the outcome was no longer in doubt. A folded steel chair, leaning against a hospital wall, was about to become the difference between a life lived indoors and a life lived in public. In wards from Long Beach to the Bronx, men barely out of their teens who had been carried off transport ships on stretchers were being handed a machine that would let them go home, get married, hold a job, and disappear back into ordinary civilian life instead of being permanently signed over to their families as invalids. What was at stake was not a piece of furniture. It was whether paralysis, for the first time in recorded history, could be something a person lived alongside rather than something that ended a person's public existence entirely. To understand why that hospital wall mattered, it helps to step back several thousand years, because for nearly all of human history, becoming paralyzed did not create a demand for a machine. It created a private arrangement inside a household, invisible to markets, invisible to industry, and almost invisible to the historical record itself. Paralysis is not a modern condition. Spinal injury, polio, stroke, and congenital nerve damage have existed for as long as there have been human bodies to suffer them. What has not existed for most of that time is any expectation that a paralyzed person would move through public space at all. The default assumption across cultures and centuries was confinement. A person who could not walk was moved, when moved at all, by other people, carried on a litter, dragged on a sledge, lifted bodily by a servant or a relative. This was not a technological failure so much as a social one. Societies before the modern era were not lacking the engineering to build a wheeled chair. Wheels themselves are among the oldest human technologies, dating back roughly 5,500 years. What they lacked was any cultural expectation that a paralyzed person's mobility was worth solving as a general problem, rather than as a private family burden to be managed case by case. The documentary record from this period is thin, and historians are careful to say so. Scattered artifacts and images have been proposed as early wheelchairs, a stone carving from ancient China, sometimes dated to the 6th century, a wheeled bed depicted in an Egyptian relief, are versions of an invalid's couch mentioned in ancient Greek medical texts. Each of these has been cited at various points as evidence of an early wheelchair, and each claim is genuinely contested among historians. The objects in question are often ambiguous. A wheeled platform might have been built for moving goods, for ceremonial transport, or for the sick, and surviving evidence rarely settles which. Rather than adjudicate these competing first wheelchair claims, it is more accurate to say that isolated wheeled devices for moving the immobile appear sporadically across many ancient cultures, without ever becoming a recognizable, reproducible product category. There was no continuity between one culture's wheeled invalid couch and the next society's version. Each was reinvented locally, used briefly, and left no lasting industry behind it. What the record does show more clearly is a pattern of numbers, or rather, an absence of them, which is itself informative. There are no production figures for wheeled mobility devices before the modern era, because there was no production in the industrial sense at all. A wheeled chair for an immobile person, when one existed, was typically a single custom object, built once by a carpenter or blacksmith for a specific wealthy or noble household, and not replicated at scale. Inventories from European noble estates in the 16th and 17th centuries occasionally list a chair for the sick or an invalid's couch among household furnishings, alongside other custom-built items. But these entries number in the single digits per estate, not in the hundreds or thousands one would associate with a genuine market. There was, in effect, a market of zero. No merchant class existed to sell wheeled mobility devices, no guild specialized in producing them, and no ordinary paralyzed person outside the nobility had any realistic path to owning one. If a person of modest means became paralyzed, the solution was almost always human labor, a family member or a servant lifting and carrying, day after day, for as long as both lived. That human labor solution is best understood not through a famous case, but through the more ordinary and more representative situation it created. Consider the documented experience of chronic invalids, recorded in 19th-century parish and workhouse records in England, well before any commercial wheelchair existed. A person left unable to walk after a fever or an accident would typically be recorded as bedridden, confined to a single room of the family home, dependent entirely on relatives for washing, feeding, and any movement at all. Clergy and parish overseers, whose job it was to assess who required public relief, frequently noted such individuals as unable to leave their beds for years at a stretch, not because no wheeled device could conceivably have been built for them, but because no such device was available to a family of modest means, and no social expectation existed that one should be sought. The household simply absorbed the labor of care as a permanent, unpaid obligation, often falling on a single female relative for decades. This was the ordinary shape of paralysis for most people, in most centuries. Not tragedy resolved by ingenuity, but tragedy absorbed by families, quietly and completely. It is worth being precise about what this absence meant economically as well as socially. A society with no wheelchair industry was also a society in which a paralyzed person's labor, and often a caregiver's labor alongside it, was simply subtracted from the economy. There was no path back to a workshop, a farm, or a trade for someone who could not walk to reach one, and no expectation that public buildings, streets, or workplaces should accommodate a wheeled visitor, even if one existed. Paralysis did not just remove an individual from public life, it frequently removed an entire household's spare labor capacity as well, since someone had to be present to lift and carry at all hours. This is one reason historians studying poverty in early modern Europe treat a paralyzed adult family member as one of the more severe predictors of household destitution, comparable to losing a working-age adult to death, except that the associated caregiving labor cost did not disappear, it simply relocated onto whoever remained. That something else arrived, not from a hospital or a workshop, but from a mining accident in the American West. And it arrived in the person of a man who needed it for himself. Herbert Everest had been a mining engineer, working in the field in the early 1920s, when a support beam gave way and crushed his spine. He survived, but he was left paralyzed from the waist down, and he faced the same options that had faced every paralyzed person before him: a heavy, non-folding invalid's chair built for hospital corridors, or dependence on family members to carry him wherever a chair could not go. Everest was, by trade and temperament, an engineer, and he treated his own paralysis as an engineering problem rather than a permanent sentence. Together with a friend and fellow engineer, Harry Jennings, he began working through the mid-1920s and into the early 1930s on a chair that could do something no wheeled invalid's chair before it had reliably done: fold flat, fit into the trunk of an ordinary automobile, and travel with its owner rather than remaining fixed to a single building. The design the two men eventually produced, patented in the early 1930s, used a cross brace, or X-frame, made of lightweight tubular steel, which allowed the seat to collapse inward on itself while the wheels stayed attached. This sounds like a small mechanical detail. It was not. Every wheeled invalid's chair that had come before, from the bath chairs of 18th century England to the solid wooden hospital chairs still in use in the 1920s, had been built as a single rigid object, meant to stay in one institution or one household. A chair that could fold meant a chair that could be owned by an individual and carried between a car, a train platform, a workplace, and a home, without requiring a building to be redesigned around it, or a servant to carry the person separately from the chair. For the first time, mobility and portability were combined in a single manufactured object available, at least in principle, to a private buyer rather than only to a hospital or a wealthy household. It would be a mistake, though, to describe this as a clean or universally credited breakthrough, and the historical record does not support treating it that way. Patent filings from the same decades show other inventors in the United States and in Europe independently pursuing folding or lightweight wheelchair designs, some predating the Everest and Jennings patent, some overlapping with it. Disputes over who actually deserves credit for the first folding wheelchair have continued among historians of medical technology and disability studies for decades, and no single account has been able to fully settle the matter, partly because patent offices in this period processed overlapping and competing claims without adjudicating which design was conceptually prior. What can be said with more confidence is narrower. The Everest and Jennings chair was the first folding design to reach sustained commercial production and distribution at meaningful scale, whatever its precise claim to conceptual priority. Being first to market, in this case, mattered more historically than being first to file. That commercial production, in its earliest years, was neither cheap nor widespread. Everest and Jennings began manufacturing their folding chair through a small company they founded together, and for roughly the first decade of production, output remained modest, sold mostly through hospital supply channels and a handful of specialty dealers rather than through any general consumer market. Individual units in the 1930s commonly sold for prices in the range of $40 to $60, at a time when the median annual income for an American household hovered somewhere near $1,500. A wheelchair, in other words, represented several weeks of an average family's total income, concentrated into a single purchase, and that estimate does not include the additional cost of any custom fitting, shipping, or repair that a specialized mobility device required. For a family already absorbing the lost earning capacity of a paralyzed member, a device priced at several weeks' wages was a genuine luxury, not a routine medical purchase. And most paralyzed Americans in this decade still could not realistically obtain one. Total production volumes for the company through the 1930s are difficult to state with precision, since detailed sales ledgers from the period have not survived in full, but scholarly estimates place early annual output in the low hundreds of units, a figure orders of magnitude below what would eventually be required within a single generation. The clearest way to understand what this new object actually changed is to look at Everest's own household, since his paralysis and his invention were never separate stories. Before the folding chair existed, Everest, like any other newly paralyzed adult of his era, faced dependence on other people to move between rooms, into vehicles, and across any uneven or unbuilt terrain. Contemporary accounts from people who knew him in this period describe a man determined not to accept the reduced domestic confinement that paralysis had imposed on virtually everyone before him. He wanted, specifically, to be able to travel by automobile, attend to business outside his home, and move through ordinary civic life without being physically lifted by someone else at every transition point. Jennings, his collaborator, was reportedly motivated in part by watching a friend struggle with exactly this problem, unable to visit anyone whose home did not have a chair already inside it. The chair the two of them eventually built was tested first and most thoroughly on Everest's own body, in his own daily routine, making his household arguably the first documented case in which a folding wheelchair's practical value was proven not in a hospital trial, but in the ordinary errands of a single paralyzed man trying to live an unconfined life. What finally moved the folding wheelchair out of hospital supply catalogs and into the hands of a genuinely large population was not a change in the machine, but a change in who needed one, all at once, in numbers no pre-war manufacturer had ever planned for. The Second World War produced a population of paralyzed young men on a scale the United States had not seen since the Civil War, and unlike in earlier conflicts, a much higher proportion of them survived their injuries long enough to come home. Advances in battlefield medicine, antibiotics in particular, meant that spinal cord injuries, which would have been fatal within days in earlier wars, were now survivable, sometimes for decades. Military physicians during the war years began keeping closer track of these cases, specifically because their numbers were unprecedented, and post-war estimates placed the number of American veterans living with paralysis from spinal cord injury at several thousand by the war's end, a population that had essentially not existed as a distinct medical category on this scale before. These were not, for the most part, older men who had already established households, careers, and domestic arrangements before their injury, as had often been the case with civilian paralysis in earlier decades. They were mostly men in their late teens and 20s, discharged from the military with the explicit expectation, backed by government policy, that they would return to civilian working life rather than spend the remainder of their years confined to a family home. That expectation forced the hand of an entire institutional system that had never previously had to plan for paralysis at scale. The Veterans Administration, responsible for the medical care of these men, could not treat a folding wheelchair as an occasional specialty purchase for the rare private buyer who could afford one, the way hospitals and dealers had through the 1930s. It needed a standardized, durable, repeatable product it could procure in bulk, issue as a matter of course to any veteran with a qualifying spinal injury, and expect to be replaced or repaired through an established supply chain. Everest and Jennings, already the dominant maker of folding tubular steel chairs, became the VA's primary supplier through the mid to late 1940s, converting what had been a small specialty manufacturer into something closer to a standard-issue government contractor. This is the shift that belongs at the center of any account of wheelchair adoption. The wheelchair stopped being a device an individual sought out and purchased on the private market, and became a device the government prescribed, procured, and delivered as a routine part of returning a wounded soldier to civilian life. The numbers from this period mark the clearest inflection point in the entire history of the object. Where pre-war annual production had been measured in the low hundreds of units, VA procurement contracts through the post-war years pushed Everest and Jennings production into the thousands of units annually by the early 1950s, an order of magnitude increase within roughly a decade. Veterans hospitals expanded their rehabilitation wards specifically to accommodate paraplegic and quadriplegic patients, a category of long-term inpatient that had barely existed as a planning category before the war. Private insurance carriers, observing the VA's willingness to treat wheelchairs as standard durable medical equipment rather than an optional luxury, gradually began extending comparable coverage to civilian policyholders through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, though coverage remained uneven and was frequently contested on a case-by-case basis well into the following decade. By the middle of the 1950s, Everest and Jennings held something close to a functional monopoly on the folding wheelchair market in the United States, a position built almost entirely on this new, government-anchored demand rather than on ordinary private retail sales. To see what this shift meant inside a single household, it helps to look at the documented experience of veterans passing through VA rehabilitation programs in this period, a very different case from Herbert Everest's own pre-war household described earlier. A paralyzed veteran discharged in the late 1940s typically encountered his first folding wheelchair not as a private purchase decision made after months of searching and saving, but as an object handed to him during inpatient rehabilitation, along with instruction in its use, before he ever returned to his family home. Rehabilitation staff at VA hospitals in this era documented specifically training patients not just to sit in the chair, but to transfer independently between the chair and a bed, a car seat, or a toilet, treating self-sufficient mobility as an explicit rehabilitation goal rather than an incidental convenience. Case files from VA hospitals of the period record veterans returning to community colleges, to clerical jobs, and to family farms using a government-issued chair as the enabling piece of equipment, a pattern that had essentially no precedent in the case files of civilian paralysis from the preceding decades, where confinement to the family home remained the ordinary expectation regardless of a chair's availability. The chair, in these veterans' case files appears not as a novelty, but as an assumed baseline, the thing a paralyzed man was simply given before anyone asked whether he could work again. It would be a mistake, however, to treat the adoption statistics from this period as settled or precise, and historians studying disability in mid-century America are consistently careful to flag this. Wheelchair users through the 1940s and 50s were not tracked by any single, comprehensive government count analogous to census data on, say, automobile ownership. VA procurement figures capture veterans processed through that specific system, but civilian paralysis, whether from polio, industrial accidents, or other causes, was recorded unevenly across state health departments, private hospitals, and insurance claims, with no unified national registry. Polio, in particular, complicates any clean adoption narrative, since the disease produced its own large wave of paralyzed patients, including children, running roughly in parallel with the veteran population through repeated major outbreaks in the late 1940s and early 1950s, and it is not always clear from surviving records how these two populations' equipment needs and procurement channels overlapped or competed for the same limited manufacturing capacity. Estimates of total wheelchair users in the United States by the mid-1950s, cited in various scholarly and industry sources, range widely, and the discrepancy is generally attributed less to disagreement about method than to the underlying absence of any single data source capturing the full population. Any specific total offered for this period should be understood as an informed estimate rather than a firm count, a pattern of undercounting that historians argue persisted well beyond this decade. That pricing power had a fixed expiration date built into it from the start. And when the original folding chair patent lapsed in the mid-1950s, the market that Everest and Jennings had spent 2 decades building open to competitors for the first time. Patent protection on the original X-frame design ran out in the middle of the decade, and within a few years, new manufacturers, some based in the United States and others importing components from overseas suppliers, began producing their own versions of the folding tubular steel chair without paying licensing fees to the company that had defined the category. This is the point at which the wheelchair stopped being a single manufacturer's product and became a commodity. A shift that mattered as much economically as any single technical advance had mattered a generation earlier. Prices, which had held relatively firm through the VA-driven boom of the post-war years, began falling as competing suppliers undercut each other for hospital contracts, veterans programs, and a slowly growing private retail market. Analysts of the durable medical equipment industry, writing in subsequent decades, have pointed to this patent expiration, more than any single piece of legislation, as the moment the wheelchair became genuinely difficult to keep out of ordinary households, since falling prices meant a purchase was no longer contingent on VA eligibility, generous insurance, or considerable private wealth. It is worth being precise about what the tipping point means here, because it is not a single afternoon or a single vote. It is the compounding of 3 separate developments across roughly a 15-year stretch. A manufacturing base open to competition after the patent lapsed. An insurance industry that had already begun, tentatively, to treat wheelchairs as coverable, durable equipment following the VA's lead. And a population of both veterans and polio survivors who had already demonstrated in visible and well-documented numbers that a paralyzed adult could hold a job, raise a family, and appear in public rather than remain confined indoors. Once all 3 conditions were in place simultaneously, roughly by the end of the 1950s, wheelchair ownership among Americans with mobility impairments stopped being an exceptional outcome reserved for the well-connected or the fortunate, and became the default expectation for a paralyzed adult of almost any income level. This is the moment the outcome, as with the earlier folding chair's own invention, was no longer genuinely in doubt. But a cheaper, more widely available chair immediately exposed a problem that earlier decades of scarcity had mostly kept invisible. The built environment itself had never been designed to accommodate one. A wheelchair user in the 1930s, confined largely to a hospital ward or a private home, rarely encountered the practical obstacle of a raised curb, a stepped entrance, or a narrow doorway, simply because so few wheelchair users attempted to navigate ordinary public streets and buildings at all. Once wheelchair ownership became common among veterans, polio survivors, and a broadening civilian population through the 1950s and 60s, that obstacle became unavoidable and increasingly politically visible. A person who could now afford and own a chair still frequently could not physically reach a sidewalk, a bus, a university classroom, or a government office, because every curb, step, and narrow doorway in the built environment assumed a walking pedestrian. The earliest organized response to this specific problem is itself a contested historical claim, and historians of disability policy are careful to flag it as such, rather than assign it to a single tidy origin story. Kalamazoo, Michigan, is frequently credited with installing some of the first deliberately built curb cuts in the country in the early 1940s, intended at the time primarily for wheeled delivery carts rather than wheelchairs specifically, though the claim to being the definitive first curb cut in American history remains disputed among transportation historians, with several other municipalities offering competing, similarly undocumented claims from around the same period. What is much better documented and far less contested is the wave of activist-driven curb cutting that began in Berkeley, California in the 1970s, where members of the disability rights movement, unwilling to wait for city government to act, are widely recorded as having poured their own concrete ramps into existing curbs at intersections near the University of California campus, sometimes at night and without official permission, specifically to make the surrounding blocks navigable by wheelchair. Berkeley's Center for Independent Living, founded in the early 1970s, grew directly out of this same population of wheelchair users, many of them polio survivors and veterans from the very generations described earlier in this account, who had grown up with access to a chair but not to a city built to accommodate one. The economic and infrastructural numbers from this stretch of decades show just how large the gap between ownership and access had become. Surveys of American municipalities conducted in the 1970s, after Berkeley's example had begun spreading to other cities, found that only a small minority of urban intersections nationwide had any curb cut at all, even in cities with substantial and growing wheelchair-using populations. Retrofitting existing sidewalks, once cities began doing so at scale through the 1970s and into the 1980s, carried a real per-intersection cost that municipal budgets had not previously allocated for, since curb cuts had never been part of standard sidewalk construction specifications before this period. The eventual federal response, the Americans with Disabilities Act, signed into law in 1990, mandated curb cuts, accessible entrances, and accessible public transit as a matter of civil rights law rather than local discretion. But historians of the disability rights movement are consistent in describing the ADA as a codification of demands that grassroots activists, particularly the Berkeley cohort, had already been making and partially implementing themselves for nearly 2 decades beforehand. How much credit belongs to the law itself, as opposed to the preceding activism that made the law politically unavoidable, remains a genuine point of historical debate rather than a settled question. The chair that eventually reached Berkeley's newly cut curbs in the 1970s bore only a loose family resemblance to what a wheelchair user is handed today, and the decades since have changed the object again as thoroughly as the folding frame once changed it. Powered wheelchairs, which existed only in crude and rare form through the middle of the 20th century, became a genuinely mainstream category of durable medical equipment from the 1980s onward, driven by advances in compact electric motors, rechargeable batteries, and later, digital control systems that allowed users with limited hand or arm function, not only those with full upper body strength, to operate a chair independently. This mattered for a population that the manual folding chair, however revolutionary in its own decade, had never fully served. people with quadriplegia, advanced neuromuscular disease, or other conditions limiting arm strength, for whom pushing a manual chair's wheels was itself physically impossible. A powered chair converted independent mobility from something available mainly to paraplegic users with intact arm strength into something available to a much broader range of paralysis and neuromuscular conditions. Extending the same basic promise the folding chair had made in the 1930s to a population the folding chair itself could not reach. Alongside this came a second, almost opposite line of development, the ultralight manual chair, engineered from aircraft-grade aluminum and later carbon fiber, intended not for basic mobility but for athletic performance. Wheelchair racing, wheelchair basketball, and wheelchair rugby, all of which trace their organized competitive origins back to rehabilitation programs for paralyzed veterans in the years immediately following the Second World War, grew by the late 20th century into genuine competitive sports with their own specialized equipment industry, producing chairs weighing a fraction of the tubular steel frames issued to veterans decades earlier. The Paralympic Games, held alongside the Olympics since the 1960s and growing steadily in scale and media coverage in the decades since, gave this equipment a global stage and a commercial incentive for continuous refinement that veterans' hospital procurement contracts, however important historically, had never on their own provided. The production and market figures from the current era illustrate just how far the object has traveled from the several hundred-unit annual runs of the 1930s. Global manufacturing of wheelchairs, manual and powered combined, now produces several million units annually, spread across a market of specialized manufacturers rather than the near monopoly a single company held through the 1950s. Powered wheelchairs and mobility scooters together represent a market valued in the billions of dollars worldwide, a figure that would have been almost inconceivable to Herbert Everest, whose entire early production run could be counted in the hundreds. Estimates of the total number of wheelchair users in the United States today place the figure at several million people, though, consistent with the pattern flagged repeatedly throughout this account, historians and disability researchers continue to note that comprehensive, precise counts remain genuinely difficult to establish, since national surveys vary in how they define wheelchair use, particularly for people who use a chair only part-time or alongside other mobility aids. A present-day account worth setting directly against the veteran's case file described earlier in this history comes from users of modern powered wheelchairs equipped with sip and puff or head array controls, technology that allows a person with little or no arm function to steer, brake, and adjust a chair's seating position independently. Documented user accounts from rehabilitation clinics in recent years describe patients with high-level spinal cord injuries, conditions that would have meant total bed confinement in nearly every earlier decade covered in this account, operating a powered chair well enough to attend university classes, hold clerical or computer-based employment, and travel independently through accessible public transit systems that did not exist in any American city before the curb-cutting campaigns of the 1970s, where the post-war veteran was handed a folding chair as the enabling object that let him return to ordinary civilian life. A comparable patient today is frequently handed a powered chair with a customized control interface, engineered specifically around whatever function his or her body retains, a level of individualized adaptation the mass-produced tubular steel chairs of the 1940s never attempted to offer. None of this represents backlash or reversal in the way some other technologies covered in documentaries of this kind eventually experience. There is no significant present-day movement arguing that wheelchairs were a mistake or that the built environment should revert to its pre-ADA form. What continued innovation has produced instead is a widening rather than a narrowing of who the object serves, extending independent mobility to populations, particularly those with severe upper body impairment, that the mid-century folding chair, revolutionary as it was, simply could not reach. Stepping back across the entire arc, from the servant carrying a bedridden relative through a 17th-century household, to Herbert Everest folding his own prototype into the back of a car, to a VA hospital handing a 20-year-old veteran a standardized chair before he ever saw his family again, to activists pouring concrete into a Berkeley curb without waiting for permission, a consistent pattern emerges. The mechanical problem, once someone was sufficiently motivated to solve it, proved to be the easy part. Everest and Jennings solved the folding frame problem within roughly a decade of sustained effort. What took far longer, closer to half a century from that invention to anything resembling full civic access, was the slower work of institutions. An insurance industry deciding a chair was ordinary durable equipment rather than an optional luxury. A government deciding a curb cut was a civil right rather than a local preference. A manufacturing sector deciding a folding chair was a mass commodity rather than a single company's specialty. Judged against that pattern, the resistance and slowness documented at each stage of this history looks less like irrational foot-dragging and more like the ordinary, grinding pace at which large institutions reallocate money and rebuild physical infrastructure. A pace that individual invention, however clever, has never been able to force on its own. What remains genuinely unfinished and worth sitting with is how much of the built world today still assumes a walking pedestrian by default, decades after the technology to do otherwise became cheap, reliable, and widely available. Consider, next time an ordinary curb or a narrow doorway is in front of you, whether it would still be there if the person who most needed it gone had been asked first.